doing their best to destroy the economy. It used to be that I would say no man's safe while the legislature's in session, but it extends to the Fed.
Yeah.
And of course it extends to the Fed. I'll come back to that. And in fact, before we come to the economy that way, I remember 50 years ago, in a couple of months, it'll be 50 years since I took my first class as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And I remember Milton Friedman, this is 50 years ago, saying the Fed always believes they have more control over the economy than they do. They always act late. They always overreact, and they're always subject to groupthink. Okay? That sound at all familiar?
Yeah.
50 years later, which is to say it's part of the DNA. And sometimes it's less dramatic others. And I sometimes say that the Fed, and I think more broadly, government in general, whether it's with fiscal policy or regulatory policy, believes that they're driving a high-performance automobile on a test track in perfect weather conditions. That's the kind of control they have. And the real truth is they're driving a jalopy with bald tires on ice in a blizzard, which is to say, of course they have some influence. I mean, of course the system has some influence, but not precise and not immediate and not nearly as much as you think. And it can be quite dangerous in that regard because you can oversteer and cause problems. And we're living through one of those periods where they're late. They've been subject to groupthink. They overreacted. They're not acting correctly at this point. So come back to the U.S. economy. Quite strong. We're adding jobs. We added 236,000 jobs last month. Everybody in America is happy about that, except
Federal Reserve.
You got it. If we had lost 500,000 jobs last month, everybody in the country would be unhappy, except
Federal Reserve.
Doesn't that tell you how screwed up their model is? And
they're using the Phillips Curve still,
they
right?
still believe in the Phillips Curve, or at least they mutter that they believe in the Phillips Curve, even though all the research done in the 1970s and 1980s, which was when inflation was high, says there is no identifiable statistical relationship, and it's not very theoretically sound. But other than not being theoretically sound and not statistically verifiable or verified, it's perfect. And for those who don't know, it's a trade-off that says there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and there isn't. And if you act as if there's a trade-off between something where there is no trade-off, you're just going to be steering a car and doing nothing. It's like, you give a little child sometimes your BlackBerry with no battery, and they believe that but it doesn't achieve anything, right? So the economy is in pretty good shape. Unemployment is low. Labor force participation is picking up. I found it funny that people said nobody is ever going to work again at a hotel. Remember that? Oh, of course they're going to work at a hotel. Nobody's ever going to work in a restaurant again. That's what you heard 3 years ago as we sat here, right, in May of 2020. Nobody's ever going to work in a hotel again. Well, you say, well, that's just stupid. That's just stupid. They're not. No one's ever going to fly again. Remember, no one's ever going to want to travel again because that's just stupid. All sales are going to be taken care of online. And well, that was just stupid. And I didn't get everything right, but I got those right, that people come back to work. So everything the economy is going through right now is economic long COVID. You've heard about long COVID, where you have coughs and weaknesses and foggy brain longer than you've had COVID many. Well, what we've got are those kind of after effects of COVID and the reactions we took and governments took. We wouldn't have the inflation. The inflation issue would not have existed absent COVID. We wouldn't have had the runaway government spending. We'd have had excessive government spending, but we would not have had the excessive government spending absent COVID. We wouldn't have had all kinds of economic things. We wouldn't have had supply shut down. Remember, you couldn't shop in a mall for several months. Literally, they were shut down. And so there's a whole lot of things. So what happened to the economy is all kinds of adjustments, and we're coming back. But I'll give you a couple of things about the economy people don't understand. We have about $4.5 trillion as consumers, more cash than we had at the beginning of the pandemic. $4.5 trillion in cash. I don't know about you, but that's a lot of money as cushion that we didn't have before. It was up as high as $5 trillion. It's down a bit. Which is, we didn't have that when you go back to 2008. That's way beyond anything we had. Second, about 42% of all American households locked in their mortgage at around 2% for 30 years. You say, well, how do you get to 42%? Real quick. 2/3 of American households own their home, and 1/3 have no mortgage. 2/3 have a mortgage. So 2/3 of 66% gets you right around there. And they all locked in really low mortgages in 2020, 2021, early 2022, right? And they've got it for 30 years. A mortgage that's probably 2 to 3 percentage points lower than any time in history. That means that they've got $3, $4, $5, $6, $7, $8, $10,000 more to spend than you would ever expect them to have given circumstances. I was like, wow, that's a powerful tool. The economy still has a lot of momentum. GDP is still about 3% below trend. Now, just think about that. Pre-pandemic trend, okay? So we've had 3 years since the pandemic began, and you would expect, let me make it simpler. Let's say we think we're going to normally grow 2.5% a year in real terms. 3 years of that gets you to 7.5%. I'm ignoring compounding, just for those who want to be mathematically correct. But 3 years would get you 7.5%, and we're 2.5% short of that trend, which is to say in 3 years, we grew 2 years. We've got a year of growth still to come. That I don't know if we get it back in the next week. I doubt it if we get it in the next week, but we're getting it back. It's concentrated in travel and tourism. Think about it. Travel and tourism is still a little below its pre-pandemic level. If we'd have been having this conversation 3 years ago, prior to the pandemic, and you'd say, how much travel will there be 3 years from now? You'd have said, I don't know, 7% more, couple percent a year, right? So we have tremendous amount of pent up still in travel and tourism, not to mention the Europeans coming here, the Chinese just coming back, et cetera. Autos, we've way underconsumed autos because in 2020, first half of the year, you weren't allowed to buy them. Second half of the year, they couldn't make them because they couldn't get parts. That went into 2021, and we've just underconsumed automobiles. And you know we're going to do that, and that's going to be a powering. We've underproduced housing, and that's going to be a powering point. So we have a lot of, and one more, corporations. Yes, some corporations finance themselves with short-term money, but you saw a lot of corporations lock in their debt for 7 to 10 years at record low rates. That gives them a lot of resources to work with. So the economy's in pretty good shape except for one thing, and that is the Fed wants to create a recession. They want to get more unemployed people. Now just think of this. We're below trend real GDP. We are below trend employment. We don't have nearly as much as we did a few months ago, but you still talk to employers and there's a bit of labor shortfall. And they want to get more unemployment. And you just go, that can't make sense, right? So the Fed is waging war on the economy. They will tell you that inflation is quite high. So let's talk about inflation. They'll tell you year over year, inflation is somewhere between 4.5% and 5%. And that's true. Depends on what index you use. There's a whole bunch of them. 4.5% to 5%. Year over year. But that tells you about a year ago more than it tells you about now. I don't want to know I want to know what's happening now.
Yeah.
So let's look, for example, at month over month inflation. Well, for the last 6 to 7 months, month over month inflation, if you annualize it, is running somewhere between 1.3% and 3.6%. And of course, what that tells you is, a year ago, there was a jump. But over the last 6 months, there's no big jump. Annualized. So last month, annualized was 1.3%. Now, monthly has a lot of noise and so forth. By the way, wages, similar. When you take wages and you annualize the most recent wage increase, 2.8%. Year over year was more like 4.8%. Okay, but again, that's about a year ago. That's not about the activity that's happening now. So think about 2.8% annualized wage growth based on recent months. Well, productivity growth is going to push wages up. And historically, you get about 1.5% of productivity growth. So that